There's a scene near the end of Home Alone 2 that you might be familiar with if you've seen the movie. Kevin McAllister, a young boy lost in New York City at Christmas time on his own, is desperate to see his family again. And so he goes to this tree at Rockefeller Center and he begins to speak out loud, whether to the tree or as a prayer or just saying words aloud. He begins to plead desperately. He seems to be willing to make any promise that he can to see his parents and his family, or even just his mother, again. He goes on saying, "I don't want any presents this year. I just want to take back every mean thing I ever said to my family, and I'll never want anything ever again so long as I live, if I can just see my mother." It's a desperate plea for the one thing he so desperately wants. And it's not an unfamiliar scene, I imagine. We see scenes of desperate bargaining often. We see them on TV or in movies and songs. The kind of desperate bargaining where we'll make any promise so that someone will give us a chance or a second chance in life. And we don't just make frantic pleas with one another, we make them with God too. Like in a movie scene when there's a man adrift at sea and he has little hope of making it back to shore alive. He begins praying, bargaining with God, saying, "I'll be a better husband and a better father and heck, a better everything." And then he goes on, "I promise I'll be honest always. And I'll obey the 10 Commandments, every single one of them. And then I'll even give you 50% of everything I have. 50%, God, if you'll get me to shore." Now that scene was meant to be tongue-in-cheek and comical and make light of it. But I think we all know so well that desperate times call for desperate measures. I imagine many of us know firsthand the bargains we're willing to make in times of desperation when our backs are up against the wall. Promises to go to church every Sunday, to give back, to never lie ever again. Promises to be a better friend, to never have another drink, to never have another cigarette. Promises to pray all day, every day. To hold our tongue no matter what. Promises, promises. If only God will give us that coveted job or the prestigious promotion. If only we make it where we need to on time. If only God can work a miracle and spare the life of a loved one. If only God will mend a broken relationship. Yes, in life there are lots of circumstances that can put our backs up against the wall, making us willing to make any kind of plea or bargain we can. But this isn't a new experience. Perhaps it's always been a way for us to cope with these most painful of times or uncertain of times. Just ask Hannah. At a time when having a child, especially a son, was the most important thing for a woman's place in society, let alone the personal pain she felt at not having children, Hannah was barren. And to add salt to the wound, her rival would use that barrenness to torment her. Hannah was desperate. Her back was up against the wall. So one time, during the family pilgrimage to Shiloh, Hannah, in her desperation, went directly to God at the altar of the holy city. She went to the only one who could take away the unbearable burden. And in prayer, she met God, laying bare her overwhelming grief. She wept and prayed, promising that if God would just remember her, would see her misery, and give her a son, she wouldn't even try to keep him. She would give him right back to the Lord to serve him, to serve the God Almighty for his entire life. It's a most radical plea. It's a most desperate bargain to calm her pain and emptiness. But knowing what we do about life's challenge, This desperate plea can almost seem commonplace or ordinary to some of us. But as the story goes along, it becomes more and more remarkable. For the next day, God remembers Hannah and comes through just the way that Hannah had hoped God would. Soon she becomes pregnant and has a son. God has provided for Hannah. It is a celebration, to be sure. And yet, I think what comes next is the most remarkable thing to me, the most surprising at least. Because then, Hannah keeps her promise. That sounds like a radical idea. Hannah keeps her most radical bargain with God. She keeps her end of it. She doesn't simply praise God for that day and give thanks, but she then offers Samuel, her son, to serve as a Nazirite. That is one who is set apart, one who is consecrated to serve the Lord in the holy temple. Now usually, here's something, Nazirites usually only serve for a certain length of time, but not for Hannah, not for Samuel. Samuel will serve his entire life, all the days that he lives. For God gave life, and now Hannah offers that same life to God in praise. And remarkable as it is, that's not all. You would think, perhaps, that keeping her end of the bargain would be enough. And yet, Hannah goes, when she goes to offer Samuel, she brings with her an ephah of flour, a 3-year-old bull, and a skin of wine, which, let me tell you, is a very generous offering. That was a generous sacrifice to God on top of the dedication of her son. Plain and simple, Hannah remembers God as God remembered Hannah. Hannah remembered God too. That's, I think, the part that we so often miss, or at least I miss. God sees me and remembers me and provides for me, and yet so often I forget to remember God back. And not just in my times of bargaining, although let's face it, when we think about some of those radical, desperate pleas, we don't usually uphold our end. But I mean at all times. How often do I seek to take credit for the accomplishments that we have, for the things I've come to have or own, for the ministries that I've led? How often do I forget that it was God who provides? It is God who works through me, through you, and through us. It is God that heals and saves and gives life and peace and comfort and wealth and hope. And yet I forget God, and so I hold tight to me, to my possessions, to my time, to my talents and my gifts. Not Hannah. Hannah is a most incredible example of faith, of total commitment to God, of unwavering trust, of good stewardship which cares for her relationship with God because God has provided for her. For in her most bleak of times, when all seemed lost and hopeless, she turned her eyes to God. She poured out her heart in honest prayer. She opened her hands to receive God's blessing, and then kept them open to give that blessing back for others and for God. Open eyes, open heart, open hands, open spirit. That is our faithful example, one that remembers God as God has remembered us. And that is the example we're called to follow today, and every day for that matter. To understand that no matter the desperate pleas we make, no matter the promises we offer, the real bargain is that God opens God's eyes to us. God opens his heart to love us. God opens his hands to take ours. God opens his spirit to remember us. It's not about the impossible pleas. It's about the true bargains that God remembers, whether in our desperate times or our ordinary ones. God remembers us in our creation and in new life. Last week, we celebrated how God remembers us when we welcomed Grayson and Calvin and Nora and Virginia and Kelly into our faith family. God remembers us every time we come to this altar, to this table, to feed together as a family. For when the world was broken with sin and when death was victorious over all things, God remembered us and gave us his Son so that we might have life in place of ours. Yes, God remembers us. Even in the most ordinary of times. It might be in the new day that you're given, or maybe it's through the job that came through when you didn't think it would, or the neighbor who opened their house and heart to you when the job didn't. Maybe God has remembered you through miracles like Hannah's, through life that we thought wouldn't come, through new birth in the face of death, or life that prevails over death. Maybe God has remembered you by offering healing when pain was there, offering comfort when those miracles just didn't come the way we hoped. For others, it's even more subtle than that. Maybe for us, the way God remembers us is by having a safe place to worship with family when blood family is far away. Yes, God remembers all of us, all of our community here in this place. For God is among us here in the kind greetings that we share with one another, in the words that warm our hearts, in the worship that wakens our soul. It is God remembering us too. God remembers us through the life-giving energy of the children that come forward each week, and the creativity and openness of our youth. God's Spirit is with us in the steadfast faith of those who have been rocks to this congregation and see us through. God's hands are opened in our outreach. God's heart is laid bare in the community that we share in our dig groups. In grand gestures and small, in the ordinary and the life-changing, God remembers us. God remembers me, and God remembers you too. As Hannah reminds us then, the true bargain isn't from bargaining with God in our desperation. It comes from remembering God as God has remembered us. It comes from a willingness to offer ourselves, our gifts, our money, our talent, our time to God, because we know that our life is God's life given to us. We know that our talents and gifts are from God. Our money means nothing unless it is used for God's good economy of justice. And our time is God's. And so we remember God as God has remembered us. In everything, God remembers us. The question this morning then is, how will we remember God? How will you remember God? Will it be like in the movies, where after that moment of gratitude, life's temptations and life's busyness causes us to forget God again? Or like in the movie, when the man finally made it to shore, by the time he got there, he was already blaming God for the mess of having to swim all that way. Or will we remember God the way Hannah does, offering back to her her one true desire, her first fruits, most precious of all? Today and every day, may we live into Hannah's faithful example. May we offer a willing spirit that says, "Here I am, Lord. I am yours. Everything that I have and am, I give back to you." So this morning, let us open our hands and our eyes and our hearts and our spirits to remember God just as God remembers us.